my colleague, and literally she's my neighbor, Melissa, to introduce our keynote speaker. And as she's coming up, ladies and gents, let's take note of the amazing work that Jet has been doing and still will continue be doing, as our CEO has just alluded to. Thank you, Melissa. The floor is yours.
Molweni kuninonke ngalentsasa ndiyanibulisa ngegama elihle lika Yesu Kristu. Igama lam ndinguMilisa Janda, and I have the great honor of introducing our keynote speaker this morning. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Nick Taylor. So Nick grew up in Queenstown in the Eastern Cape, and he attended Queen's College, which is an all-boys school. Nick's journey to education was not a straightforward one. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to interview Nick for our annual report, and he explained that as a high school student, he was interested in the origins of the Earth and the history of life on Earth. And as a result, he studied geology and chemistry at university, eventually obtaining a master's degree in geology. After university, he worked for a mining company, but found this quite boring. And so when after a year he joined the company, he saw an advertisement in a newspaper for a maths teacher, and he decided to go for it. And he has been in education ever since. Nick taught maths and science in Johannesburg high schools for 10 years, and he said to me, the reward for teaching was what students learned. He believes that you must be interested in your subject and know your subject well in order to impart knowledge to learners. After 10 years of teaching, he accepted a role as a subject advisor working in schools in Soweto in the 1980s. And after 4 years of that, Nick moved on to policy research when he joined the Education Policy Unit at WITS. And then we'll move on to his journey at JET. So in 1993, Nick was appointed Deputy Director of the newly established Joint Education Trust, and became Executive Director in 1994 when then CEO Prof. Chabani Manganyi received a personal call from President Nelson Mandela, who wanted him to be the first Director General of the new Department of Education. And over the years, Nick has contributed much to the education knowledge base. He has written journal articles, co-authored and co-edited books, and produced commissioned reports. He also served as the head of the National Education Evaluation and Development Unit, NEDU, from 2012 to 2015. At JET, he has mentored many young researchers, including myself and others in the room. Nick believes that research has always been key to JET's functioning, and his biggest interest personally is, unsurprisingly, research. He believes that he has lasted this long at JET because it is an organization that fits his interests. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the coolest dude in this organization, Dr. Nick Taylor.
Thank you, Lisa. Do you need a stand, or will you keep it in your hand?
Maybe a stand would be better.
Okay.
Good morning. Wonderful to be here and to be part of such a vibrant organization. There's a lot to talk about South African schooling and how weak and how poor it is and how many problems it's got. I disagree, actually. You know, there are only two problems in the South African school system. The one is governance and the other is skills. Of course, those are the two things any institution needs to progress and to thrive. It doesn't matter how big the organization is, how small it is, from the smallest school to the district, to the province, to the national department and the national system. These are all institutions nested within each other. Any institution needs great leadership and great skills. And it can't get by with only one of those. You can have the best skills in the world. If it's badly led, it's not going to go anywhere, and vice versa. And just, talking about leadership, let me tell you guys, most of you don't know this, or some of you won't know it. James is the best leader I've ever worked with, anywhere, anytime. And he's right, it's about culture. It's an institution you feel at home in, you feel is looking after you, you feeling you can express yourself through. That's a good organizational culture. Well, we have a problem at that level in the school system, in that the civil service in general, and not just the educational civil service, overall is badly managed. It has a poor culture. And but interestingly, I've been visiting a lot of schools this year, and it doesn't matter how big the big culture is, the district or the province or the national, there are many schools that are really doing good work. It's amazing, actually. And I was reminded of this the other day when I listened to a speech by the most inspirational man, Mr. Imtiaz Suleiman. He's the head and founder of Gift of the Givers. And he was saying, everyone complains about South Africa, but there's a lot of important stuff going on there. And he gave lots of examples about this policeman who was going above and beyond to do his job, to look after his community. And so on. Everywhere you go, there are good people working in a bad system. So it's the big picture that we need to change. So let me talk a little bit about governance before I get to the skills. One of the more interesting things I read about governance in the last few years was a paper delivered by a man called Francis Fukuyama. He's a political scientist at Stanford University. He was brought here, in fact, I think he's come here a couple of times, under the auspices of the Center for Development and Enterprise. And he delivered a paper that really took my fancy. It's called Getting to Denmark: How Societies Build Capable, Democratic, and Law-Bound States. Why Denmark? Well, Denmark has got this perfect balance. It's a vibrant capitalist economy. Individual enterprise counts a lot, and that's what drives the production of jobs and revenue. At the same time, it's got a very big social conscience. So education, health, everything is free from birth to death. Now, people pay for that. They pay enormous amounts of taxes in Denmark. And the other Scandinavian social democracies are similar. But they don't mind because they're getting such fantastic services. Childcare, round the block, round the clock. It counts really well. So now how do we, from where we are, get to a country like Denmark, where all of this is taken care of? So Fukuyama went on to say, listen, guys, you think you got it bad here. Well, actually, you're not unique. America was like this in the 1820s. At which point, around 1828, they opened up the franchise to all white males. I mean, that was a big step. Democracy, wow. Women came a lot later, and of course, other races came even later. But in the 1828 presidential election, it was now an open franchise. And they elected Andrew Jackson, who was a bit of a redneck, actually. Not much education, not much skill. And he said, listen, guys, I've won this election, and I'm going to say who gets into government. You don't need any training or anything else. I'll just appoint you. And this attitude ushered in a 100-year period, known in American history as the spoils system or the patronage system. Because politicians would get in and they would appoint their friends and family. So everyone from the postmaster to the cabinet member, from the dog catcher to the teacher, were appointed on nepotistic grounds. Sound familiar? Right? And it took 100 years to break this thing. That's quite depressing when you think about it. But the way things began to change was these guys who were in power now, taking all the money for themselves and their families, what they did do was build really good schools and fantastic universities. So the Yales and the Stanfords and the Princetons go back to those days. They, of course, put their own children through the best universities so they could get the best education. And as a critical mass of younger generation, highly qualified people came out, they looked around and said, hey, this is a mess. We can do a lot better than this if we build our civil society, our civil service on merit. So they instituted a meritocracy, although that still took another 40 years to implement because, so they passed this thing called the Pendleton Act, which stated that people had to be appointed on merit to government positions, and they had to have an exam to enter. Now, interestingly, this idea of an exam to enter the civil service had been in practice in China for nearly 2,000 years. You know, we talk about Western civilization. I mean, we haven't seen anything yet when we look at countries like China and how long they've been civilized and educated. So this civil service exam is not a unique idea. It's quite widely practiced, and it's something that's being agitated for here, by the way. But anyway, so in came the Pendleton Act. But, you know, passing a law doesn't necessarily change anything because the people in the civil service resisted this. Of course, they don't want merit-based. They're going to get kicked out. Their friends and family are no longer going to be coming in. So they resisted this thing for 40 years. And finally, never waste a good crisis. What happened was the president got assassinated, Garfield, in 1886, James Garfield. And who was he assassinated by? He was assassinated by a smart young man who was denied a position in the civil service, even though he was qualified. He was the best qualified person. They got so angry, he shot Andrew Garfield. And, you know, that kind of scared the Congress into beginning to act on these things. And, well, you know, American democracy, we could talk about that for a long time and why it's in trouble right now. But the greatest economy the world has ever seen was built on meritocracy. There's an even more interesting example closer to our time. And, you know, showing that we don't have to wait for 140 years before we get a better government. Maybe we can do it a bit sooner. It happened in the United Kingdom immediately following the Second World War. Again, you need a good crisis to get a big change. We missed our crisis in 1994, unfortunately, but we will get others, maybe an IMF bailout next year or something like that, which seems to be coming down the track quite fast. Anyway, in Great Britain, 1945, Winston Churchill was kicked out, the Tories were kicked out, and in came the first Labour government for a long time. And the Labour government was led by Clement Attlee, and they were very determined to build a welfare state. Now, the history of a welfare state in the UK goes back a long way. It goes back to Queen Elizabeth I, in fact. They've always had this tendency, and they've always brought in these things. But the Labour government, post-Second World War, brought it in a big way. And it's really interesting the way they did it. So they said, listen, to drive a strong civil service, you need skills. And we're not just going to depend on the skills of the landed gentry who go to Eton and Oxford and Cambridge. We're going to build this base far more widely. And they built a series of grammar schools, which are high schools, quite distinct from what the English call public schools, which of course are private schools. And they built this network of grammar schools, and they made sure these schools delivered excellent education. They built a network of new universities, so they could go from high school to universities. And within a very short time, Britain built this fantastic civil service based on completely strong education and a meritocracy. And, you know, the establishment of the National Health Service dates back to this time. And anyone who knows anything about the National Health Service, well, it's in trouble now through bad governance, basically. But following the Second World War, for 2 or 3 generations, it was the most widely admired health service in the world. Free to anybody, open to anybody, the best medical care anyone could think of. That's how you build a strong health service. Of course, our government now is looking at something like that, the National Health Insurance Scheme, but they don't seem to understand that you cannot build it if you don't have a meritocracy. You're going to have what we've got now in our hospitals, disaster. So, but as I said, these ideas are not absent from South Africa. The National Planning Commission, in its report of 2011, devoted a whole chapter to governance, saying, listen, we have to separate the political and administrative functions of government. The politicians must stop interfering in the administration. We need a professional, well-educated, merit-based civil service that is independent of the political domain. And that when governments get voted out, the civil service carries on, delivering services. Now, the problem with the National Planning Commission's report of 2011 is that we then had 9 wasted years under President Zuma when things went exactly backwards. And so that idea got sort of left by the wayside. Colleagues, it's been resuscitated, actually, under President Ramaphosa. He's very keen on implementing a professional civil service, and he's been saying it now for more than 2 years. If you look at his weekly newsletters from the desk of the president, this is a topic he often comes to. And last year, at the end of the year, Cabinet passed the National Framework towards the Professionalization of the Public Sector. And so this is a blueprint now for building a meritocratic civil service. We hope it won't take as long as the Pendleton Act did in America through vested interest resistance. But it's to show you, we're not a monolith. Government is not a monolith. There are countervailing tendencies that are trying to pull in a better direction. And in fact, the president is one of them, although people do get frustrated by how long it takes to do things sometimes. So let me turn now to the second problem in our school system, and that is skills. It's an absolute no-brainer. 81% of our children can't get onto the low Pearls International benchmark. In other words, we don't know if they can't read any words at all, or whether they can read words, but they can't put them together to understand what's being said. But if 81% of our grade 4s are at that stage, it means obviously a no-brainer is that our teachers don't know how to teach reading. Now, where did they get that from? Where are they going to know how to teach reading, but in the 4 years of the B.Ed study? So the problem lies in our universities. And I want to say it's at least half of the problem of our school system. We bash the politicians, we don't bash the universities. It's as much there as it is there. We've studied in the last 12 years a large number of universities, and in particular we're looking at the foundation phase and the intermediate phase curricula and what happens there. Now, we haven't studied all the universities, but we've studied a good number of them across the spectrum, from the most highly resourced to the most disadvantaged universities. Not one of them is teaching reading anywhere near comprehensively. I think to some extent our universities behave like, our education faculties behave a bit like liberal arts colleges, liberal arts faculties, where, say you're studying English literature, okay, go away and read the books, give you a lecture or two, go away and read the critics, and write an essay. Now, our education academics, to some extent, many of them behave like that, whereas they should be behaving like medical schools, like engineering faculties, where the students are drummed into all-day theory, practice, labs, field work. They've got to be working 12 hours a day. That's how professionals get trained. Not with a couple of readings here. I'll go and read about the reading wars. It's not going to teach you how to teach reading, guys. You've got to learn how to teach reading step by step. You've got to learn the theory. You've got to learn the practice. You've got to go and do it in the classrooms. So there's a real problem with our universities. And it's a problem with mathematics. It's a problem with literacy, teaching reading. But you know, the most fundamental problem actually is a language issue. The national benchmark tests are tests that are written by something like 80% of applicants to universities. And the national benchmark tests have identified that the weakest people coming out of the school system, the least academically prepared people, are going into education, apart from those going into nursing. So education is the second weakest intake, academically speaking. Something like, three-quarters of applicants to education faculties are deemed by the national benchmark tests to be operating at such a low level of language proficiency, academic literacy, that they would require extended support to be able to cope with tertiary education. Well, they don't get that extended support, and they're still passing, which is why we've got this huge slippage between qualifications. You get a B.Ed, you sit through 4 years of this, and you get your B.Ed, but there's no competence there. They are incompetent to teach mathematics, language, and reading. The large majority of them, colleagues. This is a real problem. Now, in this area, there are even more and stronger signs of change. I mentioned glimmerings of the growth of a meritocracy in the civil service. That's a very positive development. It's going to take a while to get through. But the developments in the university sector regarding initial teacher education are actually really positive, let me tell you. And we've been working on this area for more than 12 years now, precipitated by the Council on Higher Education's seminal evaluation of education qualifications in 2010, where they found that at least half of the qualifications being delivered were not fit for purpose. Now, the CHE is a statutory body that, among other things, it accredits all qualifications. And it has the power to take away your qualification if it thinks you're not doing the right job. That's important, and I'll come back to that point. So there's the CHE. They are the regulatory agent. There's the Department of Higher Education and Training, which is the policy agent and the resourcer of universities. So they set the policy and determine what should be taught in these qualifications, and they provide funding for that. And they provide, in fact, one of the things they do is they tell each university faculty how many students they are allowed to take, how many students they will be subsidized for. That's another important point that I'll come back to now. But so here, over the last 12 years, we've been working with those two organizations and with the universities. And there's been a really interesting symbiosis that is developed between the research that's happening, lots of research. JET is leading there, but we're not by no means the only organization researching initial teacher education. So there's a symbiosis between our research, between the DHET, their policy, and in fact it's quite explicit. In the 2015 edition of the minimum requirements for teacher education qualifications, they actually quoted the JET research there, saying these are the problems in the ITE sector, and they'd all come from our research report, which was explicitly cited. So policy research has got this interactive relationship. At the same time, practitioners in the universities are beginning to take heed of the research that's going on, of the policy that's coming out, and saying, hey, you know what, we better do something about these courses. And we've got new curricula being developed now in literacy, how to teach reading, and JET has got a big project on that. We're developing a reading course for teaching reading in Sesotho and isiZulu. There are courses in maths that are developing. They've been piloted in a number of universities. And there are, one of the most important bits of all of this is that tests have been developed. And it's really quite shocking when these tests are applied to first year and fourth year students. A simple, well, no maths test is simple, I guess, but it's simple in that this test tests only primary school maths, nothing else. So you give it to first year students, B.Ed students, a lot of them fail. The average is under 50%, but there's a big spread actually. Some of them are really quite good at the higher end of the curve. But in the fourth year, they've hardly moved. The average is 51%. What are they doing in 4 years of the B.Ed? They're learning very little maths. They are learning, similar tests in language tell us that there's very little development in language. And when you look at these curricula, you understand why. You know, maths gets like 5% of the 480 credit B.Ed degree, because there's all sorts of other stuff. Now, you know, I don't knock that other stuff. I think it's quite important. History, philosophy, sociology. It's good for teachers to understand things from this perspective. But where's the subject knowledge, guys? Where is the classroom practice? That's what is missing here. So as I say, a lot of important developments that are happening that beckon to a brighter future. The last little bit, and I said I'd come back to this, these developments are happening partly driven by research, partly driven by policy, but there's a stick coming down the line as well. The CHE has now instituted an audit of foundation phase and intermediate phase B.Ed degrees. And they state very specifically what this is about. And I'm going to quote from the rationale issued by the CHE about this audit. So they're complaining about the lack of education of our teachers in literacy and numeracy. And they say this: concerns persist that many of the initial teacher education graduates, particularly foundation phase and intermediate phase teacher graduates, do not graduate with the requisite knowledge and skills to teach literacy, languages, and numeracy mathematics in these early critical years of schooling. In addition to this, recent developments and insights from studies in this area suggest that a 2030 target of universal literacy cannot be met under the current circumstances. So here comes this audit. This is now quite a stick, actually, for the universities, because all their B.Ed foundation phase and intermediate phase curricula are going to be, not just curricula, but what they're doing there, and in particular how they assess these things. That's mentioned specifically in the audit. So they're going to come under scrutiny, and the CHE has the power to discredit any of these institutions. I doubt if they'll do that, because, you know, we're starting to get tougher, but I don't know if we're going to get that tough. But I've come up with a proposal for them, which I'm talking to the CHE and DHET about. There's been a bit of a panic in the last couple of years about the fact that we're not producing enough teachers. You'll be aware of this debate. And the reason for that is there's this big bulge in the teacher demographic. Something like 40% of our teachers are over 55 years old. So in the next 10 years, they're going to retire in droves. In fact, it started already. So there was this big panic. Oh, good grief. By 2030, we're going to have to be doubling the number of teachers we're producing. Well, that panic may still be out there, because not everyone has realized that actually that was a false alarm. It was based on replacing all teachers that are retiring. So for every teacher that retires, you're going to replace one, and that means we're going to have to double the number of teachers produced by 2030. Well, the really interesting news, and it's very bad news actually, the provinces are now so short of cash because of the dire financial situation of the country, and Treasury is just closing off the taps wherever it can, including limiting increases for teacher salaries. But this is such a dire situation that the provinces now can't hire these teachers that are leaving. So they are absorbing retirements and other levers from the school system by just increasing class sizes. So the learner-educator ratios are climbing dramatically every year. They're over 31 now, and they're climbing. And so it turns out that in 2021, we produced 28,000 teachers. 14,000 were hired by the state sector. Half of the teachers we produced were hired. There'll be another couple of thousand going into the private sector. There'll be another couple of thousand going into other jobs in other sectors. And there'll be a good few that are emigrating. Apparently, it's quite a good thing to do, get a teacher's degree. It's a good ticket out of the country. And everyone's looking for teachers all the time. And South Africans are known as hard workers. But nevertheless, there's still about 10,000 teachers that we qualified without jobs. And that's been happening every year now. So, you know, I'm actually saying to government, listen, guys, you can take your foot off the pedal. You can actually reduce the number of teachers we're producing for 2 or 3 years. Be careful about that, because you might not be able to turn it around if you turn it off. So just be very careful. But this gives us a bit of a breathing space to address the quality issue, to really focus on the quality issue. And my suggestion is, you've got all these tools, government. You've now got a quality measure through the CAG audit. You've got these other tools, funding, quantum that you give to the universities that you will subsidize. Why don't you cut the numbers of teachers at poorly performing institutions, especially the larger ones, and we all know who they are. Cut them in half. Don't give them money. They've got to get their quality together first. And we can afford to do it, actually, in this period where we're not hiring all the teachers we're producing. And when we need to tick up again and increase the numbers, give the numbers to the good producers. And only when the poor producers have demonstrated that they can do quality, maybe you can up their numbers again. But guys, get smart. Use what we have. There is quality in the system. We can encourage quality. We can discourage poor quality. Use these tools at your disposal. So I'm going to leave you with that thought. Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you for your attention.